Hello there, Joshua Clemens here. I'm talking to you today about the petition in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. Lot packed into a commentary on this. We can find quite a bit in Thomas Aquinas, and a whole lot in Ignatius of Loyola, as well as in Teresa of Avila. Now, we could also draw from just about any of the other saints, but I'm holding to these because they seem to be reflecting each other in a special way. So, at this point in the Lord's Prayer, just before this, Aquinas notes that Christ taught us to seek forgiveness for our sins. In this petition, he teaches us to pray that we might avoid sin. So, before, we assume we are sinners. This comes first in the order of things. Then we ask forgiveness. And then we ask to be preserved in having been forgiven, that we don't need to be forgiven again, that we are not led into temptation. And so from this, Aquinas derives three questions, or tries to answer three questions. One is, what is temptation? Two, who is doing the tempting? And three, how do we get out of or avoid or overcome temptation? So first, what is temptation? It means to test or to prove, to temper something, right? To tempt. This temptation is a kind of a proof or a testing. And this can come in two ways. Sometimes we're tested in doing good. So when we have a challenge to do good, where in some ways we have a divine dare, I dare you to love more. That is a kind of temptation that comes from God, a kind of test. God tests us. In another sense, though, we're tempted to do something evil, and in that way, only the flesh, the world, and the devil tempt us. This is the who of temptation. So temptation, more properly speaking, the way we normally think about temptation isn't necessarily these tests from God that are good, in order that we might do good or in some way avoid evil, but in this sense, it is a temptation toward evil. And that only ever comes from the diabolical, the world, or the flesh. So how is it from the flesh? Well, that's from our concupiscence, that which comes from original sin, that tending toward immoderate tension of tending to pleasures of the flesh and comforts. This is one of the issues of being an embodied spirit, not just spiritual. You won't find angels having problems with the immoderate desires of their flesh because they don't have bodies. And you don't find that the case either in animals because they're not immoderate for animals. But for us who are spiritual, it's put in tension with our spiritual nature. So the desires of the flesh are not the same as the desires of the spirit. Why did God put us together that way? Well, good question, right? It's a mystery. But in the garden, God would have been tending us. If we were tending the garden, he was going to tend us and give us a helping grace that integrates us. We call it original justice, in which the body was completely and totally subordinate to the higher faculties, and those higher faculties of intellect and will were subordinate to the divine, were subordinate to God. In the turning of the will from God, the mind is darkened, and the body kind of goes its own way. It's almost like it's ungoverned, or at least it's hard to govern. It is the ultimate disgruntled employee, right? But it hasn't quit, and you don't want to fire it because then you'd be dead. So now here you go. Now you have concupiscence, and you have a battle underway. And the Catechism notes to us, deriving in part from from the tradition, but we find it explicitly in Aquinas as well, that we're left with concupiscence after baptism, too. So that we have this battle, so that we can enter in with God and bring about his kingdom come, not only just in the world, but in our very person. Which, if you go back to that video on Thy Kingdom Come, we talk a little bit about this too, that it might come here in me and integrate so that I might be more truly kingly over my own self. So that's the flesh. The world. Two ways that the world tempts us, for Aquinas notes. Excessive and intemperate desire for the goods of this life, right? So the desire for money is the root of all evil, from 1 Timothy 6:10. Money is that measure of demand. It's a quantification on the things that the world wants. its value comes from a kind of vote of sorts, a kind of implicit vote for the goods of the world. And so an immoderate desire for that is going to lead to a kind of consumerist mentality that can be really unhealthy. And then the other one is fears of tyrants, fears of worldly power, fears of the afflictions that can be brought upon us. So on one hand, we have this immoderate desire towards, another one is a fear of, and so then therefore an aversion from. So this push-pull action within us, in which case we need the virtues of temperance to temper the immoderate desires, and fortitude to overcome fears. Lastly, the devil. He's the ultimate tempter, right? And there's a whole series of rules for the discernment of spirits in St. Ignatius of Loyola, in which he talks about he has got 14 rules for to begin with on discernment of spirits, and another 8 to boot that are a little bit more advanced, speaking about the ploys of the devil and how we are moved back and forth interiorly from either the good or the bad, and how we can discern between them, so that we might recognize if we are in temptation. Aquinas says that the devil proceeds most cunningly in tempting us. He operates like a skillful general when about to attack a fortified city. He looks for the weak places in the object of his assault, and in that part where a man is most weak, he tempts him. He tempts man in those sins to which, after subduing his flesh, he is most inclined. Such, for instance, are anger, pride, and the other spiritual sins. Now, this is fascinating because it sounds a lot like St. Ignatius's 14th rule on the discernment of spirits, where he says that the same thing, essentially, that the devil is like a general looking to see where your weak points are. One thing that's an addition here and is very helpful that Aquinas tells us is that weak point in your fortress is going to be that which, after subduing the flesh, you're still most inclined. So of all of the things, if you, let's say you're fairly well integrated and you're not sinning in a way that's immoderate or what have you, you've really worked on being a good ascetic, and where are you still inclined? Well, that's probably your dominant arena of weakness. That's the weak point. That's where you need to work. So St. Francis of Sales, for him, it was he marked out for himself that it was intemperance and anger. He'd become angry, temperamental. That's what I was trying to say. And in that temper, he really had to work hard to become gentle. And so he's remarked to have been one of the most gentle saints, a very meek man. But it wasn't from lack with a lot of effort in overcoming that dominant fault. So if you've ever wondered what is the dominant fault, where you should work on things, then first work on everything and then see where are you still inclined whenever you feel like you're in a pretty good spot. It's helpful to have a spiritual director in this, so that you're honest, or ask those who are closest to you. They might know you pretty well. And that can be subject for what's called a particular examination of conscience. We have the general examination of conscience at the end of the day, but then there's this other thing called the particular examen, where you look at one specific thing where you're trying to overcome some imperfection, trying to gain some virtue, and reviewing that in the beginning of your day, asking for grace to overcome it. At lunchtime, looking to see how many times you might have fallen into that dominant fault between breakfast and lunch, and then between lunch and dinner, you look back at it after dinner, and then at the end of the day, you could do a full general examine about anything that you've done. This is just good Ignatian spirituality. That's just good practice, and it's common across from that point on, really from Ignatian exercises on, as an exercise in Catholic spirituality ever since. Sometimes I think it has been lost on contemporary practice. The examen is already really pretty good, but the particular examen people don't generally do. If you have trouble doing the general examen at the end of the day, it seems counterintuitive, but it might actually be helpful to begin adding the particular examen as well, and it becomes easier to do the general examen, at least the general examen, if you're shooting a little bit bigger. to do these very minor things, these adjustments to check yourself. It reminds me of sports psychology, or if you're an athlete and you want to be really good at your sport, what do? You get to know your opponent and their weak spots and what their strategy is, how they operate, and then before you go into the game, you visualize the game and you see where are my weak points and where I'm going to have trouble, and what's my strategy going forward so I can win out. And what are the helps I need, and how am I going to be a good team player, right? So how am I going to use grace, and how is God going to help me? How am I going to work with my team in heaven, my heavenly team, my patron saint, my guardian angel, and God himself? How am I going to make use of what God gives me to overcome the enemy in this combat for today? And then at the end of the day, at the end of a game, you go back and you review it. And you see, how did it go? Where did it go wrong? Where did it go right? So that the next time you go in, you can be all the better. And so to grow in this as a kind of spiritual athlete, visualizing, knowing your opponent, knowing your team, working as a good team member, and then reviewing. But the dominant fault, we get some real help here with Aquinas and telling us, how does the devil tempt us? Well, he's gonna find out where's that weak point. Whenever the flesh isn't tempting you, but you still feel inclined, that's going to be the spot. That's your temperament. That's where that might be a spot. Okay. So he says that he tempts in two ways. Now, these two ways, he tempts more than just two ways. We know from the tradition. But Aquinas seems to be thinking in terms of somebody who is already dedicated themselves to the will of God, that they really do want God's kingdom come, and that's desirable for them. And so for that person who's ordered and oriented to God, it makes sense that these two ways are the dominant ones. The devil, he says, does not at once suggest something that appears to us as evil, but something that has a semblance of good. Thereby, he would at least in the beginning turn a man from his chief purpose. So if you think that simply getting drunk every Saturday night is a good thing, then the devil can just tempt you outright with something that's evil. Because it doesn't seem like it's evil, because it has the semblance of good, it's apprehended as good. But for somebody who says, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven to God, you know that that's not the right way of living. So the devil has to change strategies and start tempting under the semblance of good, or even a kind of good that might just get you chasing your tail. He tries to enter into what is most conducive to a soul that's moving from good to better, and tries to work with that soul for a time and then turn him back to his purpose. It's subtle. So he says that thereby he would, at least in the beginning, turn a man from his chief purpose, which is that chief purpose is the will of God, is going to God. And then afterwards, it will be easier to induce him to sin once he has been turned away ever so little, right? Just ever so little. In fact, John of the Cross talks about this for high-level contemplatives. He sees that the contemplative is resting in God and has gone even beyond sensible, imaginative things with God. It is God in a way that's more ineffable, and visualization isn't there. But in that case, it might be the case that the devil would tempt by giving certain kinds of seemingly spiritual consolations, illusory prophetic vision type things that might bring a sense of this is good, this is from God, and bring you away from this higher level contemplation. So it's subtle all the way up the line of holiness, where under a semblance of good, whatever is good to that person, under that semblance, and then slowly turning it around very subtly to eventually start bringing back into play those things that the devil likes to tempt us with. St. Ignatius of Loyola's Greater Rules for Discernment, his second set of rules, says this. He says, it is characteristic of the evil spirit to take on the appearance of an angel of light, so that he can begin by going his own way. So that he can begin by going the way of a devout person and end with the person going his own way. By that I mean that he first prompts thoughts which are good and holy, harmonious with such a faithful person, and then manages little by little to step out of his act and lead the person to his hidden falsehoods and perverse designs. St. Francis of Sales talks about this too, and that temptation of sacrificing the good for the better. Right? De Sales says, sometimes he even suggests the wish to undertake some excellent work, and he foresees some excellent work that he foresees we will never accomplish. This is to distract us from the prosecution of some less excellent work that we would have easily completed. He does not care how many plans and beginnings we make, provided nothing is finished. Teresa of Avila notes the same, and in this petition, she sees, if there's a temptation that's obviously evil, then that's a public enemy. She says no holy person would ever be worried about those. Those are just opportunities to win a battle. But what you're praying to be delivered from here are those more subtle temptations of the devil that are not even discoverable until after harm has been done. Right? She says, not until they have done much harm to the soul do they allow themselves to be recognized. Let us ask and often beg the Lord in the Our Father to free us and not let us walk into temptation, so that they will not draw us into error or hide the light and truth from us, that the poison will be discovered. And this is exactly Ignatius of Loyola's rules as well. He says, in the rule immediately after rule number 5, we ought to pay close attention to the progression of thoughts. If the beginning, middle, and end of it are all good, together good, and tend entirely to what is right, that is a sign of the good angel's influence. It is, however, a clear sign that the line of thought originates from the influence of the evil spirit, the enemy of our spiritual progress and eternal salvation. If the thoughts which he prompts end up in something evil or distracting or less good than what the person had previously proposed to do, or if they weaken, disquiet, or confuse him, doing away with the peace, tranquility, and quiet experienced beforehand. So it could be that it starts leading toward lesser goods or to something bad. That seems to be an indication of something bad, and it can lead to disquiet. Back to De Sales, he says, those who follow his hellish suggestions in the belief that they are heavenly inspirations can usually be recognized because they are unsettled. The person themselves become unsettled, headstrong, haughty, and ready to undertake or meddle in affairs. So this person, these are the indications, because if the devil's operating, you start becoming a little bit more like him. Right? So the person becomes more hellish. Teresa of Avila talks about a couple different temptations that come along this way. Illusions of virtue, where you start thinking you have a virtue. False humility, where the humility you think you're the worst, but you don't feel any lift, any peace in that. It's just distrust of oneself that even pushes you away from even wanting to go to prayer. It makes you cross your arms and not operate anymore according to the spiritual life. That is false humility. That's just kind of a despair or a lukewarmness that's feigning as a virtue. Excessive penances you don't want to tell your spiritual director about, or if they tell you not to do it, you want to do it anyway. Those are penances that are actually making you puffed up and disobedient and proud in the prospect that, look at me, I'm so much more penitential than that person over there. And then ultimately a self-assurance can also happen in the thought that now we're much holier and we would never go back to our old life. It's always the possibility that you could turn back and be exactly the way you were. So it requires that we be vigilant. All right, so how is one freed from temptation? Aquinas says, Christ teaches us to pray not that we may not be tempted, but that we may not be led into temptation by giving our consent to it. The soldiers of Christ, those who experience contemplation, engage in prayer, are eager to fight, says St. Teresa of Avila. She also says, I am certain that those who reach perfection do not ask the Lord to be free from trials or temptations or persecutions or struggles. They are like soldiers who are happier when there are more wars, because they then hope to earn more. If there is no war, they receive their wages but realize they won't get rich. So does God lead us into temptation? Nope, but he'll permit us to be tempted, and for this reason, we ask for the desire or the ability in charity to overcome sin, that we be overcome temptation, and so God in lead us not into temptation is to ask God that when we are tempted, that we will be able to know that we're being tempted and to have the power to overcome the temptation. Consoling thought, even the smallest amount of charity that comes from grace is enough to overcome any temptation, according to Thomas Aquinas in the same commentary. And so God will never allow us to be tempted beyond our capacity. It means he will allow us to be tempted, but he'll always give us a way out. And so we beg him that we might always know and be able to examine and find out before too much damage is done, even that we're aware that we're being tempted, and that if we're not yet aware, that we'll be aware that we were being tempted, and that we can overcome and not and adjust course. And so I hope this gives you some practical advice too, that perhaps you could be a little bit like a sportsman when it comes to your spiritual life, and look forward to the day and review the day and beg in this petition, knowing that when we're tempted, God is there for us. He always gives us the grace necessary, and that the ways of our opponent are known, and so it's a worthwhile thing to jump into the tradition even more. And if you haven't yet, jump into an Ignatian spiritual exercises, a retreat of some kind, and start making this part of your knowledge base. Because what a sad thing it would be to waste your life and not becoming a saint. And if you're going to become a saint, that means you're going to have to be a soldier for Christ. So lead us not into temptation. Tomorrow, deliver us from evil. That's our next video. I'll see you then.